Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Democracy. If you've stumbled onto this video without watching the first one, the link is on your screen now if you want to watch part 1 to contextualise this video. When I was a teen, and far more capital R revolutionary, I had a conversation with a much older friend of mine who had abandoned the idea of revolutionary socialism about the legitimacy of voting, that you could get a bunch of people together and vote on declaring the Socialist Republic of Yorkshire, but it would have no legitimacy because there is no established rule, understanding or mechanism for such a vote to truly, fairly take place. I didn't really get it at that time. Oh, I understood the point, but it wasn't real to me until I observed the illegitimate Catalan independence referendum in 2017 and discussions around Scottish independence and unilateral declarations of independence. And it begs the question, when is a vote legitimate? When is it not? Is Vox Populi, Vox Dei, only when it is restricted and regulated? For democracy to work in any way, it requires rules. It requires a shared acceptance of these rules and an understanding that everyone plays by them, something the Republicans would do well to pay attention to. Yet, when these rules were written, they cleave into stone the divisions of a day and are rather inflexible. Centrists and liberals think that if everyone plays by these rules, and just these rules, society will be okay, because even if the party elected is wrong, in 4 or 5 years, that party can be removed. The problem is that this simply isn't the case. For Hungarians and Poles, essential rights are being removed and taken away. As trans teens have found, their rights are being taken away in the UK. The French President Macron has even gone so far as to have taken away the right to film police officers engaging in police brutality. These are not isolated incidents. The trend over the past decade is for democracies to become more brutal, more restrictive, and you can argue that this is what people want, and it is the duty of a government of the day to give the people what they want. But we now stand at a crossroads. Do we continue with liberal democracy and impose it in the face of a general public who seem to want illiberal democracy? I don't have an answer to that. Nobody really does. It's a thought I think you should consider. On one hand, you're protecting the rights of everyone, while simultaneously removing the rights of everyone, and on the other hand, you're taking away the rights of someone to simultaneously protect the rights of everyone. It's kind of a paradox, I know. It's a serious issue, and it goes back to de Tocqueville's point about tyranny of the majority, and the issue with tyranny arising out of a democracy, in that if the majority wish to oppress a minority, it is very easy to do so without safeguards. At the moment, we are seeing this exact situation play out, particularly in regards to Brexit, that you are seeing a nominal majority of the populace use the ballot box to strip rights from a nominal electoral minority. Under our method, this is okay, because the majority voted, but when it comes to a question of rights, is it enough to have a simple majority? We're also having a crisis over how legitimate representative democracy can be. Representative democracy is built on the idea that the ordinary, average person has neither the time, resources, ability, or understanding necessary to make the decisions that a government requires on a day-to-day basis. This idea holds that we elect full-time representatives to act on our behalf, either as delegates or more proactively to make those decisions with our consent. This has led to the common insult of career politician, of people who spend their lives in politics and doing nothing else, who lie and are corrupt. This assumption has created a crisis of legitimacy as demagogues, that is, individuals who try to play off emotions rather than any reasonable argument, attack these established methods of governance as corrupt and not reflecting the true will of the people, which of course only they know. We're simultaneously having a crisis of truth as a recklessly privatised media companies seek to manufacture public perception one way or another, and all of these pressures are destroying the consent of the loser. Democracy is running into a contradiction, and we're starting to face tough questions. Even on Scottish independence, if a referendum is held, it is likely to be binary, with just as much lies as the Brexit referendum. After all, much of the tactics and language used by the Brexiters to such horrific success were pioneered by the independence campaign in 2014. How legitimate is a vote won by lies? How fair is a vote when it depends on such complex topics that people can't understand and so depend on their emotional pulls? How ethical is it to ask people to vote on subjects they're so woefully under-resourced to answer? One of my observations through reading and watching the history of politics is that with democracy, less is often more. That despite our yearning for increased democratic legitimacy through increased democratic mechanisms, it often results in a less harmonious state. It is a very interesting idea that Britain's Westminster system, that is, a Prime Minister sitting in the legislature, and only remaining Prime Minister so long as they command the majority of the House, is one of the most successful and stable forms of government, because so often it has a constitutional monarchy at its head, preventing the politicisation of the role of head of state, less being more. Constitutional republics, in the vein of the United States, are incredibly unstable, because the head of government is also the head of state, and this double personal role leads to a very precarious situation where people vote directly for their leader. How does any legislature, indirectly elected, ever compete with the personal, direct election from the nation? It's very easy for democracy to turn into tyranny and despotism, because the nature of our society has created a situation where ordinary people who have jobs and lives and costs do not have the time or energy or wealth to educate themselves on everything they need to know to engage fully within a democratic system. What do I mean by this? Say tomorrow there is a special referendum in your country on the regulation of concrete thickness in public construction. Now, I can hear the sound of your eyes drooping just at the thought of having to hear that phrase again. How many people do you think are ever going to be motivated to talk about that on the most relaxed day of their lives? Now put it to someone like you and I, who has a job, a family, friends and expenses. At the end of a long day when you're sat down, trying to unwind in that small, precious slot of free time before bed, are you really going to spend time researching concrete thickness? Unless your name is Percy Weasley, the answer is no. I read constitutions, political treaties and things like that for fun, and I find the concept of researching concrete incredibly tedious. Now, apply this to every single issue, and you'll find people switching off and people struggling. After all, what the hell is anyone supposed to know about these things? We're not experts, we're not remotely qualified. At best, we can do a cursory Google search or have a joke about it with our friends. It's incredibly easy for a demagogue to exploit that exact problem on other issues by making it less about the technical, reasonable points and all about the emotion. Job-killing regulations, get Brexit done, death tax, make America great again, punishing wealth creators, death panels, life begins at conception, vaccines cause autism. All of those things have zero evidence, yet are consistently exploited by people who know that their following have no time, nor energy, nor resources to fight against the social pressure and tsunami of misinformation. That is why we have representative democracy, but that only works if we elect our representatives based on their arguments and not because of the emotions they inspire or the slogans they shout. There is a deeply worrying trend over the past 50 or so years where the standard of our political debate is declining, and we vote for personalities over policies. I remember as a first-year student watching the first ever televised presidential debate of 1960 between Kennedy and Nixon. They talk about things you would rarely, if ever, hear a candidate talk about now in a debate. Even though I profoundly disagreed with Nixon's approach, you cannot doubt the intellect, reasoning and rationale behind them. If you listened without bias, you could even say that Nixon wins the debate, as those listening on radio believed, yet those watching at home thought Kennedy won because of the appearance factor. This has only gotten worse with time as political discussion has shortened and shortened into newsworthy clips or zingers of about 20 or 30 seconds. There is little, if any, time to develop arguments, to show the nuance required in governing. Instead, we rely on smaller and smaller statements of simplistic positions that do not constitute a proper electoral platform or governing basis. Fewer and fewer people are actually reading the party's manifestos and are instead focusing on personality, on who they think will make a better leader. This has caused a situation where political leaders must focus on the narrow clip and slogan approach rather than expanding on the complex ideas necessary. Our society is complex, our problems complex, and so our solutions must also be complex. This is bad enough in a presidential system where the presidential election is about the president, but in a Westminster system where it is about the party, not the politician, it's breaking the system. Democracy can only function when there is a well-informed and active electorate. Neither of those things is present in the United States or the United Kingdom at this moment. People do not listen anymore, but receive. Listening is active, it's focused, and about paying attention, weighing and judging the arguments and points made. Receiving is passive. You consume and move on, there's little rumination, and Facebook is not a good news source, neither are memes or headlines, which is primarily how people are receiving their information now on politics. I would say that this attitude of politics being dirty, somehow lesser, is helping contribute to this corrosion of our democratic system. Politics is how we choose to live our lives. It's about our choices, our beliefs, our ideas, our values. The root from Greek is translated to affairs of cities. People think it's about dirty power plays and sexy plots from TV dramas, but really it's about what we as a society choose to do, the stark choices that faces, the decisions that we must make, the priorities that we hold. For those that think that voting makes no difference, you need only look at the last 2 decades to see just how big a difference it makes. Would President Al Gore have been as aggressive as President Bush? Would Prime Minister Brown have laid waste to the nation's economy as Prime Minister Cameron did? Would a Prime Minister Miliband have caused the mess and chaos that Britain is in now? From what we do know, the answers to all of those questions would have been a resounding no. And by retreating from politics, we expose one of democracy's fundamental flaws, as described by Niccolo Machiavelli in The Discourses and The Prince, that the state becomes undermined by rich, wealthy aristocrats who have nothing more to do than sate their own ambition, their own lust for power, by ascending high and keeping it, that if left to their own devices, they will bring about the destruction of the Republic because they cannot accede to failure. That the problem of ambition by young, ambitious nobles is ever the persistent issue. And we can see it today. Boris Johnson has, for his own vain ambition, reduced the United Kingdom from being one of the leaders of Europe to an isolated pariah scrambling to try and pretend like cutting off our nose in spite is somehow a victory. Despite even the Daily Mail, one of Britain's most right-wing papers, showing exactly how worse off Britain will be, people still believe that Brexit was a good idea. It has transcended politics and instead become a political religion, as people who could not hope to understand the issue latched onto a belief that if they believe in this, it will restore their lives to what it was, as opposed to what it is. Democracy is incredibly vulnerable to this issue. Even de Tocqueville was cognizant of assuming the omnipotence of the majority, the assumption that lies at the heart of democracy, that vox populi is vox Dei, the voice of the people is the voice of God. Do you see what the issue is here? We assume that because we have voted for something, it is just because the majority of the populace wish for it, and it is therefore right that we do so. And yet, simple weight of numbers does not evade the question of rightness, that a majority of people wanting something is not the same as something being right. Nowhere is this better illustrated than in Britain over the past 5 years. Any voice criticising the practicality of Brexit or the accepted wisdom of the day on any given issue around Brexit is furiously hounded down. Neutral civil servants, whose job it is to explore the logistical practicality and then develop a plan to implement the government's desires, have been publicly decried as enemies and shouted down as conspirators because they have been unable to devise something that cannot exist. Even the Brexit deal which has passed does not meet the standards demanded by the Prime Minister or his acolytes or any of the demagogues shouting for their one true Brexit over the past 5 years. In every measurable way, Brexit provides no benefit to the United Kingdom. In every single tangible sense of the word, it is a bad deal for Britain. It has reduced Britain's access, created bureaucracy where none existed before, and damaged both the economy and Britain's standing in the world. There has been and likely will be no measurable benefit to this. It was carried out on the basis of a referendum that used illegal tactics and has serious questions over its funding, and asked a binary question where several different versions were sold to different areas of the country, right down to the then business minister, Daniel Hannan, proclaiming on the eve of the vote that Brexit wasn't about leaving the economic union, only the political one. Yet, just a day later, every Brexiter was claiming a mandate for a hard Brexit, that is leaving the economic union and the political one. There are few better examples in history of a populace knowingly voting for something against their own interests, and a government delivering it by ignoring all advice to the contrary. Likely as not, if a second Scottish independence referendum were held and won by the independence faction, it would be another such instance. I hope this demonstrates the line between legitimacy and rightness. We make the assumption every day that because we have voted, it is right, but this isn't so. A democratic mandate is a question of legitimacy, that this government can govern because a majority of the electorate has given them their consent to lead. But it is not the same thing as that legitimacy being transferred over to any decision that needs to be made. Consent of the governed is an ongoing process. It is not a one-off, nor is it indeed as simple as the winners decide and the losers must grin and bear. If we do not actively seek the consent of the loser, we are not governing for the nation, but part of the nation. This worsens political divides and increases polarisation, often resulting in the proliferation of single-choice voters, where you define your position on where a party stands on one issue alone. The right wing are incredibly good at finding a pressure point and creating that single issue, such as abortion. In the past, they have used homosexuality, equal marriage, anti-Semitism, foreign interference in the economy, and so on. This naturally builds a harsh divide which stokes tensions over and over and over until eventually conflict spills out. Unless a path of de-escalation can be found, this creates an enormous loss of trust because it creates caricatures of the opposition and demands an all or nothing position where compromise cannot be reached. A good example of this is the right to firearms in the United States. Now, the Second Amendment is not nearly as clear-cut as the right wing likes to make it. As Hannity once said on Fox, the right to bear arms shall not be infringed. There is no ambiguity there. Except, I find most of these Second Amendment people haven't actually read the Second Amendment. A well-regulated militia being necessary to the security of a free state, the right of the people to keep and bear arms shall not be infringed. That is a little different and implies that gun ownership should resemble more what Switzerland does, with heavy regulation and training so that people can organise into militias to defend their states. It is interpreted in the United States by the right wing that it is in fact the right to own whatever gun you want without regulation or prohibition. This is utterly nonsensical. The idea that I can just walk up to a store and purchase a weapon capable of slaughtering a multitude of people in minutes is utterly baffling to me. Common sense regulation, such as the control of ammunition, mandatory training, background checks, prohibitions on automatic and semi-automatic weapons, except in regulated militias, are all common sense compromises offered by the left to allow the right to bear arms to continue whilst addressing some rather egregious issues regarding safety. However, such is the polarisation that even the mention of common sense regulation evokes a visceral reaction against it, where any compromise, any hint of compromise, is seen as a betrayal and not worthy of their vote. I I'd also like to touch upon electoral systems. For the most part, the United States and the United Kingdom both use outright first past the post systems, which is whoever gets the most votes within any constituency or district wins. FPTP, as I'll refer to it from here, tends to create strong, stable and active governments, that is, governments that can enact the change that they were elected upon. This, however, has created a situation where some people's votes matter more than others. Certain bellwether areas get a lot of attention from politicians because they are enough fence sitters or floating voters there that their desires must be taken into account. And yet, safe areas for one party or another are often neglected and their issues not taken into consideration because of their vote not counting. In proportional systems, this effect is reversed. Every vote counts, but it often delivers weak governments who struggle to enact change of any sort. It also creates governments by backroom deal where coalitions are necessary. It is rare indeed to need a coalition in an FPTP electoral system. It comes down to your preference over whether you want effective government or representative government. That, after all, is your choice. Bear in mind that there are a multitude of electoral systems, from FPTP to mixed member proportionality to ranked candidates to runoffs. It is a very diverse field and far too big a topic to cover here at any reasonable depth. I bring it up to circle back to this issue of democracy, in that it is only as good as we make it. Democracy requires a lot of effort. It isn't a system for lazy people, nor can it be imposed. Hint hint, George Bush. People have to want to make decisions, have to want to be informed, have to want to get involved. Churchill is quoted as saying, democracy is the worst form of government except for all the others. It isn't the most efficient system, or even the system that functions the best. It is, however, the one that works to ensure that we give everyone a say. I'm not saying that democracy is perfect, far from it, and we must always be aware of its flaws and drawbacks so that we can continue to improve it. As absent an enlightened philosopher king, it's the best we have. We've talked about Athens and Rome, spoke of the contradictions in the big democratic movements of the 18th century, and asked what it means to live in a democratic system. Some say we're living in the twilight of democracy as it moves towards this illiberal form, but that lack of liberalism is born out of fear and a world that doesn't seem to make sense anymore. Cause and effect, from a politician's words to reality, don't really seem to matter anymore, and that's quite an issue. We need to figure out how to fix this, and fixing this is a collective conversation. It isn't for any one person to say. Some fixes are obvious, such as restoring neutrality doctrines for the press to re-sanctify our news sources. Others, such as creating a more representative electoral system, requires a national conversation about how we as a society want to be governed, how we wish to decide who we elect, because the moment we stop talking about how to improve, we regress. We have to do better. We have to want to do better. And so to conclude, I'll say this. Honesty about the flaws in our political system doesn't make it bad or not fit for purpose, or that we're somehow damaging our own country. It shows that we're aware of our faults and that we will try to improve it so that we can do right by all the people, not just some of the people. I hope I've given you lots to think on. As ever, thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week for part 1 of Free Speech.